Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. In beginning our discussion of apologetics, we need to ask ourselves, can we really trust the Old Testament? Let's just start there for now, in the Old Testament, because really the last Old Testament book was written, somewhere in the 400s BC. But now we're in 2000 AD, so we're talking 2400 years later. How is it that we can trust that we actually have the Old Testament actually preserved? Remember that the Old Testament was also originally written in both Hebrew, mainly Hebrew, and also Aramaic. Okay, so how can we be sure that we can have the same text? And maybe what's worse is that we really don't have any of the original writings of the Old Testament. The only thing that we have are copies. And to make matters worse, the only copies that we have, the oldest copies that we have, are from 1000 AD. Okay, so that's all that kind of stacks against the case for the Old Testament, and it seems like, okay, well, maybe there's some serious issue going on here. Well, let's think about that for a little bit, because I think when we picture the process of copying the original documents, we picture the game of telephone, right? You whisper to your friend's ear and they whisper what you said to the other person, and by the time it gets back around the circle, it's completely different. I think some people think that that's how copying the Old Testament worked, but let me suggest that that was not the case at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. It was grueling and painstaking, the efforts that the Jewish people took to preserve the writings of the Bible, or of the Old Testament specifically. And that's because the Jewish people believed so much that those original writings were from God, from the mouth of his prophets, that there was heavy efforts to preserve those writings, okay, and very serious efforts to preserve those writings. In fact, over the years, different groups of people were assigned the responsibility to basically dedicate their lives to copying God's word and preserving it. One of those groups was the scribes, and they were responsible mainly from the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC for preserving God's word. And they were so painstaking in their efforts that they had so many minute rules. Okay, before they would start the copying process, they would completely wash themselves clean and dress themselves in full Jewish garb. Okay, they were not allowed to write any letter from memory. They had to look at each individual letter first before making a copy of it. There had to be exactly the space of one hair or one small thread between each letter. There had to be the same number of letters in each column of the copy as there were in the original. There had to be the same number of letters in the copy total as there were in the original as well. And if it was off in any way by one letter, they would destroy it and they would start the entire thing over. Okay, and remember, they were writing by hand. Okay, that would have taken forever to write these documents, and they were so meticulous that they even counted the letters, or the words so carefully that they could identify the exact middle letter in the entire document. They could find the letter that was in the very middle of that document. And if that middle letter was different in the copy than it was from the original, they'd burn it up and destroy it. Okay, in fact, the Jews, for them, they viewed the copies as more valuable than the originals because the copies were newer and were less susceptible to decay. You see, they had to write on papyrus, which could decay over time. And so the value in continuing to create these copies was making newer and newer copies so that they would last longer. Now, again, we said that the oldest copy that we have was from 1000 AD, and so it seems like, well, maybe that ruined things. Well, that was until 1947, with one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all times, with the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which showed that the copies from 1000 AD were almost identical to the copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dated around 250 BC. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain every Old Testament book except Esther, and they were almost a perfect correlation. Okay, so we can be confident in the textual transmission of the Old Testament. And all the stuff I'm saying, you can do the research on your own as well. It's out there for the grabbing. I hope that's clear. Lord willing, I'll see you next time.